Kendra, it's wonderful to speak with you today. Thank you so much for making time for me. So we met under, I don't know, slightly unusual circumstances. I
Oh.
do a weekly post on future of work jobs, and that resulted in me reaching out to you on the internet because you had a really cool looking job and I wanted to meet you. So tell me a bit about yourself and your background.
Yeah, I loved that you reached out, and that we live in the same city so that we could actually meet up in person. So, don't be shy out there. Reach out to people on the internet. It's not that scary. Yeah, so at the time that we met, I was the future of work employee experience lead for Avanade, which is a global IT consultancy. It's a joint venture through Accenture and Microsoft. So some really amazing parentage. And I'd been with them for 16 years. And at the time was in the role of that future of work lead. And it was a really amazing position. I definitely feel over my career within the organization that I really crafted a very unique career and
Yeah.
was kind of influential in creating that next step for myself. That role and that role actually had come about through my relationship with our chief people officer, through a conversation with her where I had expressed an interest in working more in employee experience rather than just business HR, which had traditionally been the role that I played within the org. And I remember telling people, the next role that I have doesn't exist today, but it will. And that became true. And 2020, thanks to COVID, she pulled that trigger and decided that we needed an employee experience team and tapped me on the shoulder and said, okay, help us deal with this thing called COVID. How do we support our employees through it? But thinking about the longer term future of work, how else can we kind of impact our people through people programs and supporting them?
And maybe I'll dive into that a bit more. And I appreciate you might be able not to be able to share anything like super confidential, but when you were thinking of the future of work, what did you imagine might be different, and what kind of things were you trying to prepare for?
Yeah, I think one of the really clear things that we had identified was this idea of a liquid workforce,
Hmm.
although it's a bit of a ambiguous term, and I think throughout the corporate sphere people use it for different meanings. But for me, it really was this idea that we needed to develop different relationships with our contractors, be more fluid in our employee relationships, and acknowledge that the future of work was likely to start leaning towards more freelancing, consulting, contractual type of relationships. The entire employee employer proposition has really changed. What mattered to me as an employee 60 years ago is not necessarily going to matter to me today because the experiences are so vastly different. You don't see people having longer term relationships with their
Yeah.
organizations, right? I mean, just the monetary that we can talk about inflation and all of those things, but every aspect I think of life was so different. And with the onset of COVID, I think we saw a lot of people coming to two conclusions. One, that they needed more flexibility
Hmm.
and that they could do it differently. And that perhaps that the structure, the framework, the security they felt working for a large organization might not have been benefiting them as much as they had thought. And so I think you saw a lot of people starting to dabble with entrepreneurship and that idea of freelancing and consulting thanks to COVID and the silver lining of being potentially laid off was that they got to explore these new options.
And we're kind of out of the, I don't know, the main throes of COVID now, but I know that there have been some lasting impacts. But you're a great example of someone who I guess has experienced this, right?
Yeah.
You've worked in many different geographies as well. So I know that your career has taken you from the US, I think it was the UK next, and then you finally landed here in Australia. I'd love to hear some of your observations about what you found different or unique about each of those markets, maybe focusing a bit more on your experience in HR functions in those three different countries.
Yeah, so I didn't have much of a HR function necessarily in Australia since I was
Yeah,
in a global role,
yeah.
but certainly in the UK and in the US. And in the US, I had had started my career in global mobility, working with people through relocations. I held an HR tech role for a while as kind of a help desk. And then I moved into business HR and have been working with thousands of employees across the US. Moved into the UK, where I was also in a business partner role, supporting the UK business. And one of the things for sure, and you hear this as you start to travel the world, and certainly hear it here in Australia as well, is, oh, you Americans, you're so obsessed with your career and identity, it's your identity. And yeah, that's true, but I didn't necessarily feel like it was that different in other locations.
Yeah.
People still very much attribute a lot of their identity to the role that they have and the career that they have. But the I guess the drive to work, the status of it potentially was slightly different. And so you do see people in the US not taking advantage of vacations. There's certainly a European um, shared experience where a lot of cultures really honor summer vacation, right? So you see
Yeah.
countries like Spain who changed their office hours so that their employees can really utilize that. You see countries like Italy who traditionally have this period of Ferragosto where they shut down most places in August. So there's this really deeply rooted tradition and honoring of that vacation time in summer. You don't see that as much in the US. And so you don't see people taking advantage of that PTO. You see them really stocking it up for fear of losing their job. And that's also because they don't have the same remuneration packages. They don't have the same security should they lose their role. They don't have a contract period. They don't
Yeah.
have, right, their entire well-being is wrapped up through their corporate sponsored insurance program. So I think those are the two biggest things that I noticed is, they're not necessarily taking care of themselves. They are constantly thinking about the future in the US. And should I lose my job, I need to have those PTA days basically stocked away to kind of cover me during that transitionary period. I don't think the Europeans are that much different in also being somewhat worried, but there is definitely a little bit more of an observance of PTO and enjoying that summer period. And I think they are lucky to make use of that because they have potentially 3-month contracting periods.
Yeah.
So they're
Just a
going to
full
have that
security.
runway. Yeah.
That's so interesting. And in terms of innovation, I think there's the perception that perhaps the US innovates a bit faster and harder, right? Maybe that's because there's less regulation. I know privacy is a little bit less regulated, although that might change. There's some legislation in draft at the moment in privacy. But which of those markets that you've worked in do you think is more innovative as it relates to work and people?
Mhm. Oh, so that's a really tough one as well. I don't want to say anything disparaging, but I think they are operating in, again, different environments, like I just pointed out. So I do
Yeah.
think in the US there is a bit of innovation stemming from I'm trying to make the work for me. I don't want it to be
Mhm.
miserable. Like, how can I make it better? Because if my work sucks, my life sucks, right? Because we're
Yeah.
so entwined with it. In Europe, maybe a little less, where there is a little bit more of a focus on that holistic being, and people have better boundaries and do create time for themselves, where their probably innovation is coming more from a passion
Yeah.
of
Okay.
and so a desire to improve solely for the improvement itself. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I observed in my transition from the UK to Australia, perhaps a little bit less, just a bit. So I don't really exactly want to say slower pace, but I think people value their balance here. They maybe um, they don't live to work here in
Yeah.
Australia, and I don't think that's completely crazy. We have great weather, great beaches. I don't know who's crazy really, but that would be maybe my observation of moving from the UK to Australia in the last few years. But maybe in terms of some things that you're really proud of having achieved, programs or projects or initiatives across any of the geographies that you work, is there anything that stands out that you did that you're super proud of?
Um, I think it's a really great question, and like you just said, I also recognize the same things in Australia. It's why
Yeah.
I love to live here.
Yeah.
There is a much better balance of that work and life. But as far as being proud, I mean, I'm exceptionally proud of just the career that I've carved, and not just for the title or kind of the accolades or awards that I've received, but really because of the impact that I've been able to make. And that's always been my next move was always about, but how can I make a bigger impact? How can
Hmm.
I impact more people? How can I make a deeper impact? So I'd say the programs that I helped spearhead at the end of my career, within Avanade, I'm super proud of. One of the things that we did as a result of COVID, and how are we going to try to utilize this as an opportunity to experiment with something different, was to introduce a 4-day work week. Now,
Oh,
it's not, we didn't go all the way, it's a compressed work week.
yeah. Okay.
But right, we're an Accenture Microsoft shop. Like going all going 4 days, 32 hours, I think, hopefully, ideally, is where the entire world will get to soon. But we moved to a compressed work week under the idea that our people needed to have that freedom to make the choice of where and when to work, and to create that more flexibility so that they could actually honor their boundaries. I think it's really easy in every culture for us, especially now that we're working, a majority of folks are working remote or from home, is that those boundaries blur. Oh, I'll just jump online before my first meeting. Oh, I'll just finish this last thing before dinner. Those boundaries of our life have really blurred into work, which is not such a bad thing if you look at it as work-life integration and you found ways to carve out other time for yourself. But that rarely happens. That's not a skill that we learn in most corporate organizations. We see people disrespecting boundaries all the time when you're constantly getting invites for meetings when you clearly have your calendar blocked off. So I don't think we had the rigmarole around that. And so what we said was, if we move to this compressed work week, our employees are starting to kind of feel that they've met their contractual obligations. They're paying attention to the hours that they're working. And then they've hopefully carved out half a day or even a full day where they get to focus on themselves, focus on their lives, do the grocery shopping, do the things that are important to them. We had HR leaders who said, I'm now using this kind of extra time, this more protected time, to coach my daughter and her sports team. People were using it to take care of their own well-being, feeling like they could actually carve out that time to go for a run religiously, or to spend it taking care of family members. And so I think when we start to be more conscious of how and where we're spending our time, we start to honor those boundaries a little bit better, and we start to unplug ourselves from that work, and then we're 100% into our actual life. Like, how many times have you snuck your phone out during a dinner to check a work email, and you're still tethered to your work? We need to learn how to cut that tether and actually be all in at work while we're at work, and like all in at life while we're in life.
I mean, easier said than done, right? I have
Yeah.
to say, I have, a co-founder, sort of zero boundaries. So it's definitely on the list of things to get better. Now, you said a couple of interesting things there. You raised this whole working from home, working from office concept, and you mentioned people who maybe have caring responsibilities. I don't know if you're familiar with a guy called Dr. Nicholas Bloom. He's a Stanford, I think he's a Brit actually, but he's a Stanford professor, and he's done a number of pre and post pandemic studies on the impact of remote or virtual working, hybrid working, and how that impacts people's careers. And he did a pre-pandemic study that I thought was really interesting. It was a Chinese company, quite a large population of workers in a contact center. And they did this, this was all pre-pandemic, really interestingly. There was quite a few thousand workers who were fully remote. And then they
Hmm.
had peers who were fully at work. And they monitored the promotion rate of the people in the office versus the remote workers. And they found, it was really interesting, that those who were remote had a 50% less chance of being promoted. So he's expanded these studies post COVID and found a few things. If everyone's remote or everyone's in the office, your
Yeah.
chances of being promoted are equal. when you've got people who are in versus out of the office, those who are out of the office tend to suffer. And I guess
Yeah.
my hypothesis there would be FaceTime, I guess, does matter. And if you've got some people in and some people out, it's not a level playing field, because those discretionary conversations, that chance to put your hand up for a project, it kind of does matter, right? We're humans, we're biased.
Yeah.
We don't mean to be biased, let's say, but it is so much easier to connect with someone if they're also stood next to you. What do you think about that? Do you believe that's true? Do you think people who are kind of hybrid might suffer from a career perspective?
I think I think a lot of things.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. One of the things that we did when we looked at our alternative work week, which is what we called our compressed
Yeah.
work week, is we did look at the promotion percentage, and our promotion percentage of our participants was identical to our, I think by like 3/10 maybe off, to our those who had not participated. So participating in a compressed work week at least was not negatively impacting them. I think it's a really important thing to look at. But I also think if we're thinking about when you've got a split difference, yes, there is proximity bias. And
Yeah.
if we don't acknowledge and recognize that and do things to try to avoid it, we will continue to see those disparaging, those difference, the difference in those promotion rates. But I also think if you're working remotely, you might have had a reassessment of what's important to you. So perhaps career trajectory has shifted as well. Maybe you're actually spending more time with your loved ones and you're thinking, I don't really want the added responsibilities of that next level of managing people, or managing people in today's world has gotten too complex. It doesn't sound appealing to me. I'd rather continue to be an individual contributor. So I think there have been so many other changes within the world, and that there are other underlying aspects that potentially could be influencing that. But you are 100% right. If you're in the office, you are more likely to get tapped on the shoulder to take on this special project. And if special projects is what's needed to get promoted, then you're at an advantage. So I think, I don't know that we'll ever get to the 100%. I don't know that that's necessarily the right way either. Now, there are organizations like GitLab who say, yes, they've operated that way. They're doing fantastic. But you still, I think having an office is a really nice add on. There are certainly people who feel more productive in the office, who enjoy that daily commute. I miss as much as I hate to say it, I miss my, daily tube ride through London, where I was listening to a podcast or reading doing an audiobook or just catching
Huh?
up on my socials. I don't have that commuting time anymore, and I don't build it into my daily life. So I think I don't necessarily think it has to be one or the other, but I think we have to have these conversations about what could be the impact and ensuring that we're trying to make it as fair as possible. And that means employees raising their hand to say, I'm going for a promotion this year. What do I need to take? That's
Mhm.
where I think the world is shifting. And when we talk about the future of work, it is about the articulation of outcomes, being very
Mhm.
clear about what impact we're driving towards and how we're going to get there, so that we can actually look at productivity, so that people really feel like they're able to be measured against something, and it's very clear whether they met those objectives or did not, whether they did what they needed to do for that promotion or not, regardless of where they did it from.
I think unanimously we see this inside the platform as well, the GoFIGR platform, is people really, they crave clarity, and that's not just employees.
Yeah.
Um, it's also managers. They crave the clarity to be able to support their people. I guess it's like going to a wedding and not having a table plan, it's just uncomfortable. So
Yeah.
I think the more clarity we can give people on expectations and the more support we can give them to get there, I think the better for everyone. I see that just time and time and again. Now I want to segue into future of work, which you just mentioned. It's like this, I don't know, vaporous concept, the future of work. It's never quite here, right? It's
Yeah.
always in the future. But I want to try and pin you down to maybe a few predictions or maybe hopes that you have for the future of work. So what trends perhaps are you noticing right now? Maybe what are your hopes and aspirations? And maybe let's not go too long term, because who the heck knows what's going to happen
Yeah.
in the future. Just in the next 1 to 2 years, what are you noticing? What do you hope might happen as it relates to the future of work?
We've kind of touched on it. One, I think we'll continue to see organizations really promoting their well-being aspects, their programs, their offerings. And I don't think that's necessarily the wrong thing to do. I think organizations do need to be cognizant of the well-being of their employees and offer personalized plans, options, a buffet of sorts of insurances or well-being programs. But I don't think that that's going to solve the issue. I think that promoting that is probably the wrong energy to be spending. Where you need to be spending that energy is exactly what you just said, is on the clarity of objectives and outcomes and measurement. We know that what gets measured gets done. So
Mhm.
we're seeing this proliferation of workplace analytics and looking
Yeah.
at data with organizations. And that's great. But I think we need to go deeper. And I think the organizations that we'll see succeed are those that recognize that collecting the data points is important, but being very transparent about it and showing that you trust your people is equally as important. As soon as you introduce a mandate, or if you're tracking keystrokes, you've lost trust with your employees.
Yeah, and behaviorally, people hate that, right? That's the easiest way to disenfranchise your workforce.
Yep, 100%. So I think giving them that freedom but fixing the work. If the work is what's toxic, then all the well-being programs in the world are not going to keep me engaged. So having the conversations about what employees need, through the work. And I think part of that is not just the clarity, like you said, but also the recognition that I come to this piece of work differently than you do.
Yeah.
And so giving me the freedom to do it the way that I was designed to do it, allowing me to problem solve. I think that's where that innovation comes, is
Yep.
people will be extremely innovative if they're doing it for themselves. So give them that opportunity to solve their own problems and to really spearhead the efforts around there, because they're going to deliver and design a better product than you could have imagined. So I think that's my hope, is that we really recognize that we can't keep cramming people into these square boxes
Yeah.
of these roles, but that we really need to acknowledge and help them as individuals acknowledge the gifts that they bring to the table and provide them an opportunity to bring all of that to the table, to express themselves through the work that they do, to encourage that passion and that drive. And that all happens through kind of self-discovery, self-acceptance, and then the company facilitating additional personal development in that space.
Kind of like the HR functions going through some of the same, I don't know, growth that the marketing function did, right? So as soon as some of these, I don't know what exactly drove that. Maybe it's just the fact that technology caught up, right? And it was infinitely more possible to really know your customer.
Yeah.
I think we're going through the same transition. It's now about knowing your employees and recognizing their uniqueness, and, like you say, putting them in the place where they can thrive.
Yeah.
And I agree with what you said, like our needs change. Like, I'm a totally different person, thankfully, than I was when I was 20. And my goals and aspirations are completely different now. So I think we're going through this same journey of hyper personalization. And I personally see that, I don't want to be too sweeping and just to say that all younger workers want and crave this, because I actually think no matter your generation, everyone wants to have a bit more of a tailored experience. But we're getting
Yeah.
to the stage now where we're going to have something wild like 6 generations in the workforce. So
Yeah.
it has to change, right? To accommodate, someone at the beginning of their career versus someone who's maybe approaching the end of their career, especially if we're going to work longer. We just have to design work and workplaces differently, I think.
100%. And one of the things I see a lack of, and I guess I haven't looked that hard, but what about those transitioning out of the workforce? We do
Yeah.
have this amazing opportunity of these boomers who are leaving the workforce, and oftentimes it's like, okay, when are you retiring? Especially at critical times like right now with the way the economy is. HR is looking at cutting heads. Who can we kind of see if they're ready for early retirement? But this is an entire generation that we should be tapping for their knowledge,
Uh-huh.
because there's a lot of really beautiful, useful things there. So what about, transitioning them out to part-time roles, to contracting roles? I think we just need to get more creative about that. Again, like I said before, about that employee employer value proposition, the dynamics have changed so much. We've got to take advantage of short term and part time and different contracting systems, because there's a lot of people who want to be involved. They just don't want to be involved 40 hours a week from the hours of 9 to 5 at this certain location.
I think you tap into something really important there. And we have a kind of, I don't know if you'd call it an engagement module or like a career, we call it the career upgrade experience. And in that, we ask people what makes them tick.
Yeah.
And what we found, we don't monitor age demographics in the platform, in all honesty, but we did notice with more tenured or more experienced employees, there was a higher propensity to want to teach others. And that's such an untapped gold mine.
Yep.
I don't know when it clicks over in you, I don't know when that clicked over in me, but I sort of flipped over from kind of wanting to take as much as I could from the workplace to actually being equally, if not more, motivated by giving. And so, imagine that you could take your more seasoned or experienced workers, or even some of your younger workers, and have them kind of cross mentor each other, develop each other. It's such an untapped goldmine, I think, in my view.
Yeah, completely. I think bringing people together, when we talk about diversity, we have to also look at diversity and demographic of age, and experience. And so bringing people together through things like reverse mentoring is such an untapped playing field. There is so much that could be gained by just providing that opportunity to get different people in the room and at the table,
And get
really
out of the way.
debating
Yeah.
all of it. Yeah, just let them go. So I think that's a really important group of people that we should really be thinking about and focusing on. And like you said, asking people, I'd be really curious to know, if you did have some of that demographic, the age information, are the younger generations able to articulate what motivates them? Are they able to articulate it better than the older generation? Because I think, again, it gets into that personalization, and it's what I see in the conversations I'm having these days, is that people are feeling unmotivated by the workplace. They're feeling unsatisfied. They're unfulfilled, right? They feel that there's things lacking, and they don't have that opportunity necessarily to teach or to have the impact that they want to have. They're feeling a little bit more like a cog in a wheel, and nobody wants to feel that way. That takes away all of our uniqueness and our the ability to really make that impact. And so asking the question is a really first important step. And I think engagement information, we need to continue to collect it, but we need to also be digging deeper into the questions that we're asking, because we haven't necessarily done that for 40 years. We're still asking quite a bit of the same questions. And what I'm hearing from more and more people who are leaving the workforce, whether that's through choice, through burnout, being laid off, and deciding not to go back into the workforce and doing something on their own, is that they lost that motivation. They didn't feel like they could bring their whole selves. They didn't feel like they were sharing in the profits, or that they were fully satiated and satisfied by the work that they were doing. So there's a lot to uncover there.
I really wonder if I know that, like, as we record this today, GPT 4.0 got released yesterday.
Yeah.
It's everywhere. So some of that, I mean, it's taken a real growth leap, right? And I can't help wondering if it's going to go one of two ways. The optimist in me is like, okay, it's going to take away all of the robot type work that we do. The pessimistic side of me is like, okay, what's going to be left, and what will the human's role in this be? Any views on that? What's your probability of doom?
Yeah. My doom's high. I think the thing that scares me the most about it is the loss of creativity, which is the thing that we as humans bring to the table that I don't see AI fully replacing. So we've got to be very clear about when we use it and how we use it, because it does have so much potential in alleviating a lot of the daily grind, right? And the mundane tasks that we do. We think about the past and the invention of, with Ford bringing in the assembly line,
Yeah.
right? He talked, and Tesla talked about, oh, in the future they're going to be working 4 hours a week. Well, yeah,
Well,
we're
that
not.
hasn't materialized.
Yeah, that has not materialized, and I don't think that AI is going to necessarily reduce our work hours, because we're not actually focused on reducing our work hours. We're just focused on the work that it can help
Productivity.
produce.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I do think that it's a bit scary, and I think we have to be very clear about relying on it too heavily for some of those creative, for writing, etc., because people will lose that touch. So there was an interesting study that just came out this week, I think, from Accenture. They talked about how 75% of organizations are not prepared with strategies to really ensure positive employee experience outcomes as a result of generative AI, right? So most companies are not prepared to tell their employees how to use generative AI. So it's a really great asset, but again, we have to be very clear. Let's make sure we're using it for the right things and not the wrong things, that we're not stripping away the human beauty that we bring to the table, and that we're just using it in more of that kind of task-oriented way.
I love it. I have to say, using generative AI has changed my life. I use it to draft things, inspire me. I get it to do analysis that I just couldn't do myself. I
Yeah.
don't have the time, the brain power, the resources to do it. So in terms of like kickstarting ideas, it also shields my team from a lot of my craziness, right? I can ask the AI rather than asking some poor soul in my team to do something wild. So I don't know. I'm a big fan, but your comment about companies not preparing their workforce, I wonder if it's because they themselves are still coming to grips with what might this mean. And I don't know, the way I think about it in terms of horizons, there's the kind of right now horizon, right? Maybe what could I do quicker, faster? What don't I have to do? What
Yeah.
would it take me one person that it took me two people to do in the past? But there's a bit of an existential threat. It also makes me think, what will my company do in the future? So again, we're an HR tech startup. There are things that we can do now that would have been inconceivable just 9 months ago
Yeah.
that really get me thinking about what it is that we should be doing and building. So if I level it up a bit, it's quite big and it's quite scary to imagine what this might do to not only at a company level, but an individual level. I still feel optimistic. I still feel excited. We're going through a decline in birth rate. I know doesn't feel like a today problem, right?
Yeah.
But if we are going to continue shrinking as a population, we almost have no choice but to automate. So I don't know. I'm scared and nervous and excited and everything all at the same time.
Yeah,
Now,
I agree. I agree. And I think that like you said, it spurs some brilliant ideas. And uh, it has so much potential and so much possibilities. And even now, I'm already pairing my child who's 7. We
wow,
talk about how to ask questions that are going to generate the right answers. We talk about prompt engineering, because
isn't
that's
that
going to be a
wild?
skill set that he's going to need more so than how to write cursive.
I 100% agree. The analogy, I was laughing about this online with someone, is like, how useful has trigonometry or whatever it is been in my life? Well, not very. But yeah, what your son will end up learning or even not learning. This is interesting to think what he won't need to learn because of generative AI or AI holistically. So
Yeah.
fascinating to think. I'm almost glad I'm not a really young person now, if I'm quite honest.
Yeah, agreed.
Now, you have gone through your own interesting transition, and we can see in the background there you have a new podcast. What's next for you? And tell us about your podcast.
Yeah. So I've launched the Like-Minded Radicals, which is a podcast really focused on kind of workplace transformation, cultural transformation. It's predicated on the idea that the workplace is broken. There are a lot of people who are leaving. And again, like I said, either it's burnout, layoffs, just hitting the top of the ladder and looking around and thinking it's not really what I expected. And I'm meeting a large percentage of people who are choosing not to go back to the inside, as they say. Um, and so I'm exploring, well, what is it that made you leave? And what is it that you are potentially trying to fix? Because what I also see is that a lot of people leave and then say, well, I'm going to help fix it from the outside. And so it's like, well, let's figure out what's wrong so we can fix it before we lose all of our really great talent. And what I'm hearing is, I don't know if it's existential crisis, things that were brought on by COVID, um, you know, again, things that are brought on by a burnout, but a lot of people are feeling like they're not able to make the impact that they want to. They don't necessarily find as much meaning in their work. I love that companies are starting to talk about purpose, but your purpose isn't necessarily my purpose. So how do you facilitate me to understand what my purpose is so that I can find ways to ensure that I'm living my purpose in the work that I'm doing that's working towards your purpose as an organization. Again, it's about that hyper personalization. And so um, we speak to people who are still within organizations, what they're doing to approach things differently, people who have left, like yourself, who are founders, just trying to explore, like, what is it that needs to change so that we don't continue to see an exodus of top talent, and that we can really influence and impact the experience for everybody. Because work has become, it's not just about my employee experience, it's about my human experience. It dominates my time, and the workplace should be a place where I can go and express myself fully, and bring all of my talents to the table, and produce something that is meaningful and impactful. Um, and right now, that's not always necessarily the case. So,
And where can people find your podcast?
yeah, it's called The Like-Minded Radicals. You can find it on Spotify, Apple, Amazon, all of the smaller podcast producers. You can also watch us on YouTube at The Like-Minded Radicals, and follow along and get to know the radicals a little more on www.thelikemindedradicals.com.
Now, final words from you. What advice do you have to anyone in an HR or maybe leadership role, who is trying to think a bit more radically or innovatively? Any final words for anyone watching this?
Yeah, I think get deep. Get deep with yourself first. And then, find ways to get a little bit deeper with your employees, and understand their desires and their needs and their experiences, um, and provide them the freedom to explore those would be my advice.
Kendra, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me. I have, as ever, thoroughly enjoyed this conversation.
As have I. Thank you.